Funding for AIDS, Four Corners of the Crisis, provided by Equicor, Equitable Health Corporation of America, which believes that only by confronting today's healthcare challenges can we assure tomorrow's miracles, and by the members of WETA.
Now, I think AIDS is going to be around for the duration. I think that we certainly are going to get a much better handle on this than we have now.
I have some real concerns about the whole issue of AIDS in the black community. I'm very concerned about the lethargy in the black community about this disease.
I don't believe like I did anything wrong. I don't have regrets from my life. I don't regret my sexual activities. I don't regret my sexuality.
I no longer count the number of people who I knew well who have since come down with AIDS and are living with AIDS today or have died from AIDS.
Good evening. I'm Ron Goldfarb. We have begun to associate AIDS with a name or a face. Actor Rock Hudson, former Redskins great Jerry Smith. But if you don't know of someone with AIDS now, chances are you will within the next few years. It's estimated that 270,000 Americans will have contracted AIDS by the year 1991. Their survival rate will average only 18 months. As you may know, doctors have only recently been able to slow the debilitating effects of AIDS on the human immune system. At that, only in some cases. No cure so far. No vaccine anticipated for years. The experts advise us that one cannot catch AIDS. You can only get it through the transfer of semen or blood products, and not through casual contact. Yet many folks remain unconvinced. As one of our guests this evening will tell us, AIDS seems to have reached the point where logic stops and fear takes over. But not for all. There are some people who must deal directly with AIDS every day. We found a few of them in Four Corners of the Crisis.
I usually work from around 6:45 in the morning, and it varies in the evening. I don't usually get home any earlier than 8:30. Most times around 9:30. Sometimes when things really get tight, don't get home till around 10 p.m. Do that from Monday through Saturday, except that Saturday, instead of getting home at around 9 or 10, I usually take off late afternoon, early evening. And then if it's a usual week, I usually take Sunday off.
It's 6:40 on a Monday morning. Dr. Anthony Fauci looks forward to another day, but he isn't expecting any miracles.
You get a feeling, particularly if something went on the previous day or two, that makes you get a feeling that something might be breaking. You get a feeling that something will come through during the day that'll be important. We don't really think in terms of major breakthroughs. Like when I'm riding to work, I don't get the feeling that all of a sudden something is going to happen today that's going to be a major breakthrough that's going to tear the whole thing apart and really answer the questions, because that's just not the way the situation is with this disease, with AIDS or with any of the kinds of diseases that we work with. The best you hope for is that you're going to have a good, productive day, and something that is going to happen that's going to be a tangible step forward. That's enough to put you, to give you a lot of excitement and pleasant anticipation.
Well, I pray every morning, and I pray every morning for an end to this disease, and I pray every morning for everyone who has it.
Over the last 3.5 years, Jim Graham has dealt with more than his share of the tragedy that accompanies AIDS.
You really go through the process with someone of AIDS from beginning to end, as I have many times. Intellectually, our knowledge of AIDS is so limited that the intellectual ability is also very limited. Emotionally, I know for myself, I cannot on my own, really take in emotionally all that what this involves. And what that leaves me with is the spiritual condition. Because other than education and prevention, which someone referred to today as our silver bullet, what we have is we have to have faith in the outcome.
Any hope that accompanies Dr. Wayne Greaves on his way to Howard University Hospital is overshadowed by the reality of his work.
For the most part, I expect another day of frustration, and I see it more as not so much being optimistic, but playing for time. If only this patient can get over his bout of pneumonia now, I can get him out, I can keep him on some medicines. Maybe he'll just hold on until there's a drug available that we can treat him better. It frequently will make me stop and think, because generally these are young people. It will make me stop and think, you know, well, this person's life is slowly coming to an end. True, my life could end as I step out the door and I'm run over by a truck. But this is almost a relentless process where you know you're going downhill steadily, albeit slowly but steadily.
My main worry in the morning is how am I going to fit in everything that I have planned to do today? How am I possibly going to fit it in? And sometimes that's overwhelming because I still haven't quite worked out 100% control of my life.
Preston was diagnosed as having AIDS 14 months ago. Despite 2 serious bouts with pneumocystis pneumonia, life goes on.
There's stuff I'm always excited about. There's stuff I'm always looking forward to. And I don't know how people live any other way. I really don't. Because when I know people who just feel so completely trapped and so completely locked in, I'm like, well, you got to do something to get out of that. You got to do something to get out of that.
While the numbers of those infected with the AIDS virus continue to mount nationwide, AIDS is of no more concern than it is right here in the Washington metropolitan area. In fact, a recent Washington Post survey found that AIDS is considered the greatest health problem facing our nation today, and local statistics seem to support that concern. The Washington area has the 4th highest concentration of AIDS cases in the country.
As more people are infected, the pool of infected people increase. As the pool increases, the chances of getting infected increase, and you have a snowballing effect.
Dr. Anthony Fauci is director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, centered at the National Institute of Health in Rockville, Maryland. He also serves as coordinator of all NIH research on acquired immune deficiency syndrome. He is, in a sense, the person in charge of all AIDS research conducted and administered by the federal government.
How have you been feeling it?
I feel fine. I feel fine. My energy level's high. My appetite's good. I'm a little overweight.
That's good.
I'd like to lose a few pounds.
I very rarely tell a patient that that's good to be overweight, but with you, I'm glad to see that you're keeping your weight up.
Joel is one of hundreds of AIDS patients who has participated in treatment programs at NIH. He was diagnosed 27 months ago as suffering from Kaposi sarcoma, a form of skin cancer common in AIDS patients.
Patients with Kaposi sarcoma like Joel generally do better from the standpoint of their hospital days. In fact, their longevity and the mortality is much better in patients with Kaposi sarcoma. And Joel's very, very well aware of that you measure that in years as opposed to just a few months.
The immune system right at the moment is good enough that I probably will not get PCP or pneumocystis unless something drastically happens. But I've had many friends with KS who have ultimately gone on to get PCP and some of the other infections and then died.
Yeah, in fact, we've gone over this with Joel several times, but if you plot immune function and you look, for example, if you had a chart and if you had immune function here where you measured it here, you have immune function over time, starts to go down a bit. If the immune function gets to a point at this level here, that's so low that almost invariably anyone would get an opportunistic infection. In individuals with Kaposi sarcoma, they have some impairment in immunity, and they get Kaposi sarcoma at around this level. Some of them plateau and go along like that without any major decrease over an extended period of time. Others would continue to go down, and they would wind up with Kaposi sarcoma in addition to opportunistic infection. Joel is at the point where he's stabilized at a certain level. He has an abnormal immune function, but it isn't progressively deteriorating. We don't understand what cofactor, if any cofactor, is involved in Kaposi sarcoma, why Kaposi sarcoma is seen almost exclusively in male homosexuals who have AIDS as opposed to intravenous drug abusers and others. So there's a lot of unknowns that are puzzling us about it, but not such a puzzle that we can't, in a organized, well thought out fashion, approach the problem and design the appropriate experiments to hopefully answer the problem.
Few answers came from the Palais de Congrès in Paris, where the world's leading AIDS experts met in June. 2,500 doctors and scientists left with little encouragement. Eagerly awaited press conferences had little to report.
I don't know.
We don't know. Optimism had prevailed at the first AIDS conference in Atlanta 14 months earlier. The AIDS virus had just been identified and a determining blood test had been devised. But AIDS had now become a global threat and was spreading rapidly with neither a vaccine nor a cure reported to be in sight. The atmosphere here was comparatively subdued. However, American researchers offered a glimmer of hope, Dr. Anthony Fauci in particular. Bone marrow transplants performed by Dr. Fauci at NIH had, for the first time, succeeded in restoring a human immune system severely damaged by AIDS to apparently normal health. The process involved 3 AIDS patients and their identical twin brothers, the transplanting of bone marrow and injections of virus-attacking drugs. Although no improvement was shown in the health of 2 of the patients, a third improved to the point where he was able to return to work. Dr. Fauci was careful not to characterize this as a breakthrough. Yet, he saw it as another important block of knowledge which researchers have been gathering at a phenomenal rate.
I think that the speed with which the scientific knowledge has accumulated with this disease is totally unprecedented in biomedical science. To go from 1981, from a new disease that no one even recognized existed before, to just a few short years later, to having a etiologic agent, the cause of the disease, namely the HTLV-3 LAV virus, to have that virus completely characterized with regard to its genomic makeup, its genetic composition, to very shortly thereafter have a test for antibody, the ELISA test that screens for antibody, to not too long a period of time after that, to have a drug that at least in a subset of patients is showing to be effective. I think that is an extraordinary amount of accomplishments over a relatively brief period of time.
The obvious urgency in battling the spread and effects of AIDS is reflected in the money that has been made available for AIDS research. Nearly $135 million will be spent this year researching and treating AIDS at the National Institute of Health alone. That's twice what was budgeted last year, and considerably more than the $3.5 million that was available when Dr. Fauci first recognized a potential problem 5 years ago.
When the recognition of this new syndrome came about in the summer of 1981, I can remember very clearly looking at it and saying, isn't this interesting that male homosexuals in the West Coast and the East Coast in New York and LA and San Francisco were getting this strange kind of pneumonia, which I know from my experience as a physician you only see in very immunosuppressed patients, usually patients who you give drugs to immunosuppress them, like cancer drugs. And then when we heard about the pneumocystis, the Kaposi sarcoma in the same group of homosexual men, I said, wow, this is a little bit more than coincidence.
It was like another new disease, like toxic shock, like Legionnaire's disease was something new. The difference was that it was occurring in groups that traditionally have not been looked upon favorably by society in general. First reports were in homosexual men, then there were reports in intravenous drug abusers. So it was like a new disease, something different, something happening, something we need to watch.
In the early part of the summer, I noticed that I was feeling a lot more tired and that I was having a lot of diarrhea, but I didn't think that much about it. Then in July of last year, '85, I had 2 friends die of AIDS. One was a very close friend, a former lover who I'd lived with for over 3 years. And we were still very close friends. And it was very hard to take at the time. I got seriously depressed.
Several of us, myself included, felt that we were going to deal with a problem that was going to mushroom and have major implications just on what we knew about the level and the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases in the male homosexual population, the level of hepatitis B in the IV drug abusers, that once you introduce an infection into a population that has very active sexual interactions, you are going to see a rampant spread. We knew it. It was only a very, very small amount there at the time, but it happened. You saw that extraordinary mushrooming.
I was working full-time, working on a dissertation. I was involved, I was about a week away from moving in with someone in a romantic relationship, and in the middle of all of this, we broke up in the middle of this relationship, and it was just a bit too much. And for about close to 6 weeks, it was literally all I could do to get out of bed and drag myself into work in the morning.
As it became clear that other groups were becoming involved, like hemophiliacs, like children who society considers innocent, it became clear that this was a fairly serious problem.
And I went to see my doctor, and I forget, I remember him saying, "Your immune system is on the floor."
I was confronted with a stark reality of the clinical presentation of the illness, that there were actually people whom I was seeing who were dying from the disease.
I remember thinking I was gonna faint. I was still kind of out of it from the Demerol they had given me, and I just didn't really lose it. For about 5 or 10 minutes, I just couldn't hear anything he was saying to me. I was just kind of sitting there thinking my life was over.
Washington has a very large gay and lesbian population that has become an important part of district life, both culturally and politically. They've blended in downtown and in neighborhoods without the hassles they might face in other less progressive communities. You need only look up and over the DuPont Circle metro station to see that a problem that generally affects gay men is fast becoming accepted as everyone's problem. Several blocks away is Adams Morgan, ethnically rich, diverse in lifestyle, in home for one of the oldest gay clinics in the nation.
Whitman-Walker Clinic has been operating since 1973, providing, for a number of years, providing very useful medical services, primarily in the area of the identification and treatment of fairly common sexually transmitted diseases.
Jim Graham is executive director of the Whitman-Walker Clinic. Once operated by a handful of volunteers only a few years ago, the clinic now has a full-time staff of 25, offering counseling and support, as well as medical and financial assistance. Whitman-Walker has been forced to expand to meet the demands resulting from the spread of AIDS.
We heard about it as something that was happening in New York, I think, initially. And we also heard about it because there were people here who were sick. They were very few in number, but there was a recognition, and there was a forum held, which was attended by well over 1,000 people, was held in April 1983.
Before the diagnosis, how would you describe your lifestyle in terms of sexual activity?
Figuring with the help of the calculators at NIH, I have probably had close to 1,000 sexual partners in the last 8.5 or 9 years.
In terms of our prevention efforts, in terms of education, in terms of people changing their lifestyles, the difference is dramatic. It's a 180-degree turn from April 1983 to the present.
Much of the focus at the Whitman-Walker Clinic is on dispensing information about AIDS, the correct information. Information on how the AIDS virus is spread and how it isn't spread, methods of practicing safe sex, how best to protect yourself, physical symptoms to watch for, and where to turn if you have been infected.
Not unless you've been sexually active. For safe sex, use condom, no anal intercourse.
Albert Robinson is just one of about 30 volunteers who routinely put in a shift manning Whitman-Walker's AIDS hotline. He says it's something he does out of need.
Well, I was just bouncing off the walls. I felt like I wasn't doing anything. I never really viewed the gay community as being there. It was always something I ran out to clubs, or if there was ever a gay community, it was to take care of my sex life. And I kept hearing about friends who were friends of friends, and it seemed like it was moving closer and closer, and I found myself being preoccupied about AIDS all the time. Good morning, AIDS information. Yes. It would be a fever of over 100 degrees lasting for weeks, swollen lymph nodes in several places, loss of appetite, exhaustion, diarrhea up to 8 to 10 bowel movements a day, night sweats, periods of waking up drenched in sweat. Drenched. You'd probably want to change the bed linens before you try to go back to sleep. We're all about the same. Everyone's terrified of it. There's not a rational response at the moment.
The costs of the local AIDS effort would be multiplied many, many times, but for the volunteer energies that we are able to attract and retain. In terms of the buddies, in terms of counselors, in terms of group leaders, therapists, lawyers, doctors, nurses, other medical personnel, all of whom giving of their time without compensation. We have people who are involved every single day in extensive contact with people with AIDS. Sometimes the patients are in very debilitated conditions, which represent some very compelling emotional situations. And we're very, very careful to give these good people the support they need.
Well, we have some difficult cases going on right now. The more difficult cases are the IV drug-related cases that include children, families, people in public assistance housing. And especially the cases we had were cases where there were like 2 children involved and the mother's in the hospital and baby has AIDS, and what do you do with the family that does not have anyone to take care of it? You would love to be able to say there's somebody out there in the city who can take care of it, and there just isn't.
A couple of times every month, Judy Polnicek, a psychiatrist who counsels the terminally ill and their families at St. Francis Hospital, drops by the Whitman-Walker Clinic to help the staff air its feelings and frustrations.
Is that harder for you to handle, or just new stuff?
I think it's frustrating in terms of going to everybody and his brother in town and saying, this is the situation that we have, we need your help to help interact with us, to help with this family. If we don't have someone to go out and take care of the baby during the day or provide the home care in terms of doing the things like diapering the baby, feeding it, making sure that it's okay, and it's really difficult to find that sort of service.
The kids get to me. The kids really get to me. Kimberly, when I saw Kimberly in the hospital. In the hospital, we were there because the hospital was not taking what I consider to be adequate care of her. The nurse was refusing treatment. The first nurse was. We got that pretty much taken care of.
Yeah, that's an interesting development. You know, the fact that a clinic which has been historically devoted to specifically gay and lesbian health care being called upon to respond really to much broader concerns, which is one of the ways in which the AIDS crisis has impacted all of us here.
And it's wonderful when we hear about situations where our services are working, because for me it counterbalances the total frustration of that brick wall that we keep running into, where there just aren't the services there, and there doesn't seem to be the time to get out there and create the new services.
I have, I no longer count the number of people who I knew well who have since come down with AIDS and are living with AIDS today or have died from AIDS. I know it's in the dozens of people, in addition to the people who I know through the work at the clinic. You know, and I've been thinking about how to describe this to people, but you know, what comes up for me and what is, it feels very much like a small town, and part of which is dying. And so it's not just a situation where you have a disease that is impacting a lot of people. It's a disease that is impacting a lot of people in a relatively small community. 90% of the local cases are gay. And I feel sometimes like I'm in a small town where you hear, you know, you've lived all your life and you hear, well, the baker is sick. You know, the art teacher is sick. The postmaster is sick. And it's that type of feeling, because it's even if you don't know the person firsthand, very, very often you know someone who knows the person. The network, you know, brings the news back to you. And so it feels very much in some ways like a community under assault. And under assault in a way that we just, you know, just other than through prevention and education, we just don't have any other answers at this point.
We continue to find support in you and in each other. Thank you. Amen.
I'm glad we had this. Yes.
I am too.
Almost last week, we just got it.
So in the discussion, it was felt that dapsone trimethoprim therapy was at least as effective as trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, or pentamidine.
Was there any improvement in chest x-rays?
They didn't use the chest x-ray as evidence of clinical improvement.
This group meets once a week under the direction of Dr. Wayne Greaves, Chief of the Infectious Disease Division at Howard University Hospital. It's called the Journal Club, part of the medical teaching program for fellows training in the field of infectious diseases.
Sometimes we review articles on AIDS, other diseases. We look at the methodology and the article, the way the study was performed. Was it a reasonable study? Were the conclusions valid?
This discussion concerns a San Francisco study of an experimental drug on AIDS patients suffering from pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. The group was somewhat suspicious of the results.
It's a very biased study, I think. I mean,
You think it's biased?
I mean, I think anybody with pneumocystis should have been considered for the study, not just people that had it for the first time.
And that's what happens sometimes in medical literature you need to be aware of. People make comparisons from one study where the drug is not used in a controlled clinical trial fashion to compare the results with another study. And you can end up with misleading conclusions.
Keeping up on the latest AIDS research had become somewhat of a lonely job for Dr. Wayne Greaves. Shortly after he arrived here in 1984 from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Dr. Greaves realized that no one at Howard University Hospital was involved in the research and treatment of AIDS. Today, he is one of two.
Not only is it becoming more complex because of the newer approaches to managing these patients in terms of therapy, experimental agents, but counseling becomes a very intricate and delicate problem, both in terms of counseling the patient himself or herself, their families. There are also some legal ramifications that are beginning to appear, which we sometimes become involved in, also become involved at the level of infection control in terms of being sure that patients admitted to the hospital are placed in the appropriate setting where they're not at risk to other patients or staff. That has become perhaps the single biggest problem. How do you persuade a physician or a nurse or another hospital employee that it is all right to have a patient register in the emergency room or be admitted through the admissions office without becoming concerned that you are going to become infected by the AIDS virus and develop AIDS?
That responsibility has fallen on Dr. Greaves and Frances Page, nurse epidemiologist in charge of infection control at Howard University Hospital.
I myself, before I knew any about the AIDS virus and how it spread, I was a little concerned too about working with AIDS patients. But since that, having read a lot, having gone down to CDC, talked with Dr. Greaves, and from all the newer studies that have come out from NIH and CDC and all the rest of the researchers have shown that the AIDS virus is only spread by blood and semen. These are the two main ways it's spread. And it's been really hard to convince the nurses, housekeeping, maintenance people, all the other people that work in the hospital that these are the two main routes that they need to be concerned with.
And we've gone from nursing unit to nursing unit to department. I mean, we've virtually covered all the various departments in the hospital, given them what we call an overview of the problems of the disease and the mode of transmission, and attempting to answer their questions and allay any fears that they might have had.
But although Dr. Greaves has been successful in providing an education on AIDS to the staff of Howard University Hospital, he has had his problems with the community the hospital serves. The patient population is primarily black and relatively poor, and Dr. Greaves believes a dangerous pattern has developed concerning AIDS and its impact on the black community.
It was in fall of '85. Just looking through the literature, looking through the reports from CDC, I recognized that 25% of the cases were in blacks. And as I went backwards in time, it remained relatively constant. And I became surprised that no one had made mention of it. It had certainly never made national news, but the data was there, the figures were there.
A major part of the problem can be traced to IV drug abuse. It accounts for about 17% of all AIDS cases nationwide, and traditionally, inner-city blacks have been more involved in intravenous drug use. The exception is Washington, D.C. IV drug use accounts for only 8% of the AIDS cases in the district.
A second problem I see is the fact that blacks in general have a relatively lower level of health care, and their health status, in fact, is somewhat lower than that of whites, comparable age, and so on. And I think if one were to read the report on the status of minority health put out by the Public Health Service sometime recently, it is clear that there are deficiencies in both the health status and the health care of minorities, and in this case, blacks. So if one pictures a virus coming along, attacking the immune system of a relatively healthy person compared to one who is already at a lower level in terms of health status, I think one can theoretically or conceptually visualize that the effect might be more staggering. Also, we know from data in other areas, particularly in terms of cancer epidemiology, that blacks in our group are less likely to undergo screening or to have screening tests performed for cancer on a regular basis. The patients that we see, for example, in our hospital with AIDS are often those who have had the disease for a while. And the median survival of the patients that we see here, and we've done a study to look at this, is approximately 7 months, compared to 18 months nationally. Survival meaning survival from diagnosis to death, because ultimately survival is zero in this disease.
Of greatest concern to Dr. Greaves is how AIDS is threatening the future of blacks, which starts here, because 52% of all women with AIDS are black. A disproportionate number of children with AIDS are black, a figure estimated to be as high as 60%.
Well, they're just the innocent victims of the whole tragedy.
Dr. Graciela Gray is a pediatrician who is working with Dr. Greaves to study the incidence and effect of AIDS on infants. In one preliminary study, 65% of infants born to mothers infected with the AIDS virus also tested positive for the AIDS virus several months after birth. Researchers believe that figure to be much higher. The Howard study, run in conjunction with DC General, will measure the chances that infants testing positive will develop full-blown AIDS.
A lot of our mothers in a high-risk group, which means either IV drug abuser or perhaps they're like a prostitute, and because of that they may have been exposed to the AIDS virus. What can happen is that there is a passive transfer of antibody, and the baby may be HTLV3 antibody positive because of that passive transfer and can indicate no other problems. However, what we have found is that most of the babies who are born to mothers who have a positive HTLV3 antibody, most of them are positive at birth and persist to be positive. And since there's so few at this time, we don't know if that would indicate in the future if they'll persist, if they'll become negative at 6 months, if they'll become positive and just remain positive, have no other problems, or if they'll be positive and develop full-blown AIDS within a certain time period.
What this says to me is that if this cycle keeps up, mother infected, child infected, and we don't know yet whether or not infection is 100% in the pregnant woman who gives birth to a child, but certainly is high. But if this cycle keeps up, the black community in general will suffer some serious problems in terms of population growth.
If you spend enough time in the school system, you see what the effects of poor prenatal care and poor early health environment does to kids. You just see all of these black kids that have all these learning disabilities. It's just incredible the degree that they have these things. And you realize that this isn't something that's inherent in your skin color. This is something that's been inherent in the kind of world that you get brought up in and the kind of effects that it has. And I think that this is going to be one more thing in that direction. And I am surprised that people, again, who are in positions of power in the black community aren't thinking about this stuff, that this is like a time bomb and it's real serious.
It's been particularly frustrating. I would characterize the response to the black community as perhaps fragmentary and unorganized. There have been attempts by some groups to hold a conference here, a conference there. The only organized effort that has followed through, in my opinion, in the black community is, again, efforts directed towards gays.
I really do believe a lot of it is fear. A lot of this is fearfulness. A lot of these organizations are afraid they'll lose their funding if they go join up with something as unpopular as AIDS. You know, they'll be seen as an organization that's populated by a bunch of homosexuals.
Homosexuality and bisexuality is frowned upon. It's looked down on more, I think, in the black community. Black families tend to ostracize those within their family network who are homosexual or bisexual. And for that reason, I think it creates greater pressure for those who are not heterosexual to not reveal their true identity in terms of their sexual preference.
I think that they just see it as such a hopeless situation. It's like, God, I'm black, oh God, I'm gay, and now I have AIDS on top of that. And it's like, I can't see any hope. There doesn't seem to be, it's sort of like, well, I'm black, at least there's black people who will hang around me. I'm black and gay, well, at least there's a black gay community that support me. Oh, now I have AIDS. Oh no, everyone's going to abandon me. And I've heard people say basically that. Now no one wants to have anything to do with me because I'm contagious. It's not true, but I hear people saying it.
Even though Preston was diagnosed 14 months ago, he continues working towards his doctorate. Preston is a psychologist. He has a caseload of patients, and for that reason asked that we conceal his identity. But Preston doesn't conceal the fact that he has AIDS. He is a member of several organizations that are calling attention to the problems of gays, minorities, and AIDS, and has become a popular spokesperson.
When I looked at my life, and I looked at where I was with things, and I saw that I had what I thought was a pretty good grasp on dealing with AIDS. And then I looked around and I saw so many people that didn't, and I said, I said, how many black persons with AIDS do you know that have as good a background in mental health as you do, and sort of was blessed with good health, a stable job where my boss knows and has been more supportive than I can ask. He'll never know how much he's done for me. Plus, a family that's been more supportive than, that has been 100% wonderful. And friends who, by and largely, have been the same way. For most respects, I couldn't ask for anything to be sort of more perfect, but that there's something bigger than me that's going on with all of this. And that I would be denying sort of my place in this world or what have you if I was not to talk about this kind of stuff.
Last December, Preston entered an experimental drug program at the National Institute of Health, but was told he didn't meet the criteria for testing.
It ran some more blood tests, and one of my blood levels, my platelet count, was too low. And they said it had to be at least 100,000, and for some reason my platelet count was like 80 to 90,000 and it wouldn't go up. So they finally dropped me from the study.
So Preston decided to experiment on his own. He took the underground route, south of the border, to get the drugs not available to him in this country.
This is ribavirin. It's an antiviral drug, which means that it's intended to act directly on a foreign virus in your system. The price on it is in pesos, but a 2-month supply at the time cost about $200. This right here is isoprinosine. It's sold by the name of pranosine in Mexico. Antivirals in general are sort of like scattershot. They kind of just knock out everything, and then the hope is that you'll take the ribavirin and it'll kind of knock everything out of the system, including the AIDS virus, and then you take the isoprinosine and that'll help your system recover.
But Preston has now put these drugs on hold, at least for the time being, and is taking advantage of a major announcement made on September 19th.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming to this very important news conference, which was called hastily. What we are discussing today is the first therapeutic agent, AZT, that seems to hold promise for some AIDS patients.
AZT, azithromycin, manufactured by Burroughs Wellcome of North Carolina. It's an antiviral drug originally produced in hopes it would fight cancer, and it had been sitting on the shelf for 15 years. In February, researchers began administering AZT to AIDS patients in double-blind, placebo-controlled experiments. But the experiments had come to an end. The results were so promising, it no longer would be ethical to withhold the drug from the placebo group.
To date, there have been 16 deaths among 137 patients receiving placebo, and 1 death among 145 patients receiving AZT.
Charts showed how, after 6 weeks of treatment, the condition of patients receiving AZT had stabilized while the others continued to deteriorate.
We find this information, these data, very encouraging, but we must caution against premature conclusions at this time. Although the preliminary data indicate that AZT decreases the mortality rate in some patients, it does not show how long patients may be able to tolerate the drug or how long these responses noted may be sustained.
AZT would now become more widely available, but there were warnings. AZT was not a cure. Testing had not been completed, and there could be toxic side effects. The positive results had only been seen in AIDS patients suffering from pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, so AZT would not be made available to everyone with AIDS. There were many, many questions, and Dr. Anthony Fauci was called upon to provide some of the answers.
If one looks at the numbers of individuals in the country right now who are alive with AIDS, that ranges somewhere between 11 and 12,000. There are probably some more who have not yet been reported. Of that group, one would have to guesstimate approximately 60% of those individuals are individuals who have pneumocystis carinii pneumonia and AIDS. But for this particular study, the Data Safety Monitoring Board felt that it was appropriate and in fact essential to terminate the study for that group of patients. It would seem logical and would seem the obvious thing to do, which will be recommended, that AZT would substitute for placebo in that particular trial if in fact that trial was using a placebo.
And after the news conference, there were more questions.
I haven't been sleeping much at all. You send in the history of the patient. It will be evaluated. If the patient falls under the criteria, then the patient will either be approved or not approved. But what we'll have then is some fine-tuning of that. But you have to start off with something. We would have never known that there was any difference between untreated and treated if you just hadn't anybody to compare it to. FAUCI. You get interested in a problem. You work very hard at it, and you don't have any idea where that's going to take you. Ever since I was in medical school, I always felt that being a physician, I wanted to work on the most serious problems, the most difficult problems, and people who had very serious diseases, diseases that could kill you because the stakes are high. And the stakes being higher brings out in you, I think, the best of you, the best of your effort, the best of your intelligence, the best of your creativity. So where that would have taken me, I had no idea when I made that choice. It happened to have taken me to a position right now, which, as I mentioned before, to me, it's the best possible job in the world.
I knew that this would be a challenging opportunity. No one at that time, 2.5 years ago, no one had any sense of where the AIDS crisis would lead. No one, I don't think anybody was predicting that there would be now 700 and nearly 800 cases in the metropolitan area. Or how the city would react, or how the suburban jurisdictions would react, or how the community would and is reacting. So I had no idea at all.
The district and suburban governments have made AIDS a major concern of the Metropolitan Council of Governments. The local public health officers from Virginia, Maryland, and the district have appointed an AIDS ad hoc committee on which Jim Graham is a member.
And I'm very happy to be able to inform the study group or the task force that we have received a contract for $46,500 from the Virginia public health authorities. And so this is very helpful to us in being able to continue our Northern Virginia services. What's exciting about this money is that it's one of the very few examples, it may in fact be the only example, of Virginia tax dollars crossing the Potomac in support of a project which is recognized as providing services to the people of Virginia. I think in this fiscal year we are still going to be receiving better than, or approximately 1/2 of our total income will come from the people we serve. Right from the beginning, and I don't want to diminish the importance of the city, of the Commission of Public Health support, but right from the beginning, our local community has responded. And it has responded not only with its volunteer energies, which have been so important, but it's also responded with its money.
But the community response hasn't been all positive.
This particular assemblage was not here to get your input. Your input is needed.
That response came from a neighborhood in Northeast Washington. It came following the announcement that this former orphanage on Otis Street was being converted into a home for AIDS patients by the Missionaries of Charity, an order founded by Mother Teresa.
Our response to their suffering does not mean that we set aside our strong teaching on the immorality of homosexual activity or the abuse of drugs.
But some neighbors were angry.
Now, right now, we're dealing with after the fact. And if we're dealing with that after the fact, evidently somebody assumed that we would react a certain way.
The type of response heard here on Otis Street has kept Jim Graham from revealing any of the locations of the homes operated by the Whitman-Walker Clinic.
Today we have 5 houses which are housing a total of 34 persons. The houses have been carefully distributed so that no one neighborhood has more than one house. We have houses in 3 different wards of the city. Our most recent house was opened in Ward 3, just north of Georgetown.
Joel and Andy are both residents of the new house near Georgetown. Andy came here from Oregon to begin experimental drug testing at NIH. Joel is now an outpatient.
Well, each person has his own private bedroom, and then we share the rest of the house together. Unfortunately, the bedrooms are not equal in size, so there's some people who, of course, get more space than others. All of the amenities that would be considered essential for life, and some of them I think that even aren't, Perhaps a little bit more luxurious are provided. We all have their microwave in the kitchen.
Also, since I've been there, which has only been a week, there's been 3 occasions where boxes of food have been brought in. And all the refrigerators and the shelves have been stocked with food. People have brought lamps in. I mean, it's really a nice place.
There are the inevitable concerns of the neighbors.
We heard an incident the other day of someone was concerned that a garbage man might pick up our trash and then might pick up their trash and somehow or another convey the disease to them. Well, it's just impossible.
And there are personal concerns as well.
The only thing we have in common to begin with is a disease, or a disease process. AIDS is really not a disease. And it takes a sense of maturity, it takes a sense of give and take in order to make the place compatible for everybody.
My biggest concern is trusting people you don't know. And basically that's what you have to do when you ask for help.
Although Andy and Joel have hopes of regaining their health and returning to a normal life, they understand the odds are against them. But if AIDS is to be so closely associated with dying, it must be credited with providing some new insights on living. It has, on those whose lives it has touched.
You know, it's a hell of a disease, and it's really been, I would not, if I had to do it all over, I certainly wouldn't have gotten AIDS just to get valuable insights into my life. You know, I could forget all of that. But since that's what happened, I feel like, yeah, I'm gonna deal with it.
I think it has given me a greater appreciation for the importance of living every day for what it's worth. I have been being in a job where every single day, sometimes every hour of every day, one is reminded that we have a 24-hour lease on life.
Well, maybe you have some allergies or you have hypertension or diabetes, but you're alive and you can basically do the things you want. You still have your self-esteem, you still have your privacy, your job, you're financially sound. It almost, in a sense, makes you very appreciative of what you have compared to what you can lose.
See, I personally believe that I'm not gonna die from AIDS.
Well, one of the most compelling moments always for me is that when someone comes in and they have a diagnosis of AIDS and they say, I'm going to be the one to beat this. It's going to be me. And I've heard that many, many times. And I want that to be true every time I hear it. And I know also that every time I have heard it, it hasn't been true in the end.
I know that death is a possibility and that I could die. And I made my peace with death, which is another part of it, is I decided I'm not going to be afraid of dying. And that I had a good life and that I don't have regrets about it.
So why don't we just maybe eat light or something and then go. I think it's 8 o'clock, but I appreciate it. I told him we're coming. He said bring Jennifer too, so there's really not going to be a problem.
The valuable insights Dr. Fauci has gotten have come not only from his work, but from Chris and Jennifer as well.
Oh, she's falling asleep in the sun. Yeah, she's going to be fine. She's going to be fine, little Jennifer.
Chris can share many of her husband's feelings and concerns. She is a clinical nurse specialist, providing treatment and care for AIDS patients at NIH.
Not all nurses like to work with dying patients. I've done it before, and it's amazing how much you can learn from people who are dying. Not that it isn't difficult. I mean, each time a person dies, it's sort of wrenching, because especially in a situation where you get to know them, and you get to know them in a fairly close and intimate way, and so when they die, you feel like you're losing a friend as much as a patient. But people somehow, almost without exception, when they're close to death, become remarkably strong and beautiful. You know, they really can teach you a lot about what's important about life, and, you know, how to be close to each other, and things that are really hard to learn in other ways. So I think even though sometimes it's difficult, it's really been very rewarding.
Jennifer's arrival 3 months ago has also provided some insight.
When I look at Jennifer and see her, it becomes clear how important life is. It couldn't possibly be more important than its personification in a little baby, I think. So that really, the other thing that it comes to mind also just looking at Jennifer is that I can remember when I was a little boy, and my mother was taking care of me. I mean, I don't think I can remember back to when I was 6 weeks old, but I remember when I was a little boy, and I realize now just how fast things have gone and how rapidly time flies. And it also gives me, almost paradoxically, a feeling of the fact that I am a finite person and my life is going to come to an end the same way that Jennifer's life came to a beginning. That was, it becomes almost a philosophical issue. She just causes me to stop and think a little bit more than I usually have.
It all goes by so fast. You think, wow.
Welcome back. Educating the public on the issue of AIDS is of critical importance if we are ever going to slow its spread through the general population. Joining me now to discuss that issue is Dr. Wayne Greaves, Chief of the Infectious Disease Department at Howard University Hospital. Jim Ringer, AIDS Service Director at Whitman-Walker Clinic. Mauro Montoya, Legal Project Coordinator at Whitman-Walker. And Jean Tapscott, AIDS Coordinator for the D.C. government. Let me ask you all this question, I suppose especially you, Dr. Greaves. Where did AIDS come from? 5 years ago, no one ever heard of it. Now, one cannot look at television, read a national magazine, look at the newspaper without some new disclosure about AIDS affecting women, AIDS out of in minority groups, new medical tests. It's all over the place. Is this something that the media has just discovered, or is this something that just happened all of a sudden?
I don't think we know where AIDS has come from. My feeling is, based on the evidence that we have, that this is a new disease, a new phenomenon. How new is still not clear. I think that some of the publicity, though, undoubtedly is due to the media as they concentrate on topical stories and interesting topics.
Is the media giving the story an honest and fair play, do you all think?
I don't think all the time the media is giving it. I think a lot of it has been they focus on the public hysteria, and that's not good because it tends to perpetuate the myth that AIDS is casually transmitted. But there has been a lot of favorable media response as well. The human interest stories, the stories on the service providers, the volunteers. It has helped a lot to get the knowledge out to the public. What we need to do now is just focus that knowledge more on education and letting the public be aware that AIDS is not casually transmitted.
Jean, how do we do that? How do we educate the public, get the right information out?
It's a massive job. And we've hired, we have a couple of contracts in place, and they're providing material that will go out and educate people. They're going to be meeting people on the streets. They'll be taking information and education materials into all walks of the city life, so that we plan to get to everybody, including those people in high-risk positions, such as prostitutes or IV drug abusers. So it's a massive job that the city is working very hard on trying to put forth.
Now, the Surgeon General recently suggested that we start in the schools, not just limited to the people who have been the key people involved in the problem so far. Is that going to be helpful?
Yes, it's going to be quite helpful. The school system here is already involved in some education. Sex education is mandated through 12th, from 12th down to the kindergarten. So AIDS education will be part of their general curriculum, and the school system is very much going to be a part of the educational process that we'll be using.
Jim, I know the clinic does a lot of educational work. What kinds of roadblocks are you running into? What kinds of successes are you having?
I think for us it's been an educational process. I think we've learned along the way that information which may be applicable and helpful for gay males may not be the appropriate type of information that has to be disseminated for prostitutes on the street. IV drug users, people which may be on the periphery of society, who may not be as well educated or as articulate as other people which we're trying to reach. So I think we have to specialize in terms of those groups that we're trying to reach when we talk about education. Commenting on the school system and their involvement in educating our children, I think that there's got to be parental involvement too. I think that families have to start feeling more comfortable with talking about safe,